The Pharisees are a group frequently mentioned in the Bible, especially in the New Testament, and are known for their conflicts and controversies with Jesus. They are commonly seen as figures involved in fights and disputes. But who exactly were the Pharisees? What characteristics did they have that made them so significant in religious history, both during the period between the Old and New Testaments and at the beginning of Rabbinic Judaism? What was the daily life of these people like? And what did they teach that led Jesus to criticize them so strongly? Do they all deserve the negative reputation they have received? Many people talk about the Pharisees, but few really know who they were or what they represented. In this video, we will explore the true story of the Pharisees to better understand this intriguing group. The Pharisees were one of the three main religious groups among the Jews mentioned in the New Testament and were known for being opponents of Jesus Christ. Along with the Sadducees and the Essenes, they formed the main religious strands of that era. Have you ever wondered why they were called Pharisees? The origin of the name Pharisee is somewhat uncertain, but many believe it comes from a Hebrew verb that means to separate or to divide. If this is true, it suggests that they were seen as a group that stood out from the others, perhaps due to their particular beliefs and practices, which made them seen as separatists. But what did this separation really mean for the Pharisees? They sought to distance themselves from certain practices, influences, or groups, but it is not exactly clear from what. Some think they wanted to move away from impurities and worldly customs, while others believe the term might have a more historical meaning, perhaps as a political stance or a unique set of practices and beliefs. Indeed, historically, the Pharisees distanced themselves from various things. For example, they avoided associations with the house of the Hasmoneans, a Jewish dynasty that ruled Judea during a period called the intertestamental period. They also resisted the growing Greek cultural influence of the time and distanced themselves from other Jews who did not strictly follow the commandments and the law of Moses. Some believe that the term Pharisee may also suggest a special skill in interpreting the scriptures, marking them as rigorous interpreters of the law. However, it is important to know that not all scholars agree that the word Pharisee comes from the Hebrew verb to separate. Some believe it derives from the Aramaic for Persian. Why would this be relevant? These scholars point to possible connections between some beliefs of the Pharisees and Zoroastrianism, an ancient religion of Persia. They suggest that the Pharisees, considered innovators in some religious ideas, could have been called Persianizers. This would also help explain the tensions between them and the Sadducees, a group that included the elite and Jewish religious leaders. This discussion makes us question how the Pharisees originated, and several theories try to explain this, but none is completely accepted by everyone. One idea is that the Pharisees appeared during the times of Ezra and Nehemiah, representing those who rejected the pagan practices that some Jews had adopted after returning from exile in Babylon. Another theory suggests that they began among the scribes who wanted to continue the work of Ezra, dedicating themselves to the study and rigorous observance of the law. The most accepted theory says that the Pharisees emerged before the Maccabean War, with the main objective of resisting Greek cultural influence and maintaining the observance of the laws of Moses. The Hasidim, or pious men, who led this resistance movement in the 1st century before Christ, are seen as the precursors to the Pharisees. These men, deeply committed to their faith, fought against the efforts of Antiochus Epiphanes to impose Greek customs on the Jews, which eventually contributed to the support for the Maccabean revolt. After the war, when the temple was rededicated and religious freedom was achieved, the Hasidim began to distance themselves from the political issues related to the Hasmoneans, who were the leaders of the revolt. They chose to focus more on religious life than on politics. From this distancing, several new Jewish sects emerged, including the Pharisees. In many ways, the Pharisees continued the work of the Hasidim, dedicating themselves to living and interpreting Jewish laws and traditions. The Pharisees stood out not only for rigorously following their religious practices, but also for criticizing the increasing involvement of Jewish leaders of the time in political matters. The historian Flavius Josephus was the first to mention the Pharisees, describing them alongside the Sadducees and Essenes as groups that had different interpretations of Jewish doctrines in the first century. It is interesting to learn about the history of John Hyrcanus, a Jewish leader who lived from 134 to 105 before Christ. Initially, he was an ally of the Pharisees, but he distanced himself from them after an incident at a banquet where they questioned whether he was worthy to be the high priest. This incident triggered a period of tensions and conflicts between the Pharisees and the Jewish political leadership, which began to support the Sadducees more, especially during the reigns of Aristobulus I and Alexander Jannaeus, sons of John Hyrcanus. Despite the adversities, the Pharisees continued to influence the common people, probably due to their dedication to Jewish traditions and laws. Their influence grew even more during the reign of Alexandra, wife of Jannaeus, who saw in the Pharisees a way to strengthen her own leadership. With this, the Pharisees gained a prominent position, influencing political and religious decisions of the time. However, after the death of Alexandra and during the power struggle between her two sons, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus I, the political prestige of the Pharisees began to decline, especially after Aristobulus I, supported by the Sadducees, took the throne. Despite all the political changes and the increased pressure from the Romans, the Pharisees continued to be important to the people. Even Herod, a leader who succeeded and who did not follow the teachings of the Pharisees, recognized the need to maintain a good relationship with them due to their power and influence among the masses. But how were the Pharisees organized? Unlike the Sadducees, who were primarily aristocrats, the majority of the Pharisees were merchants and traders who strictly obeyed Jewish laws. The Pharisees distinguished themselves from ordinary people by their rigorous adherence to legal traditions, despite many not having a formal education in law interpretation. This deep commitment to religious practices led the Pharisees, who were generally not experts, to seek guidance from the scribes, who were the professionals responsible for interpreting legal issues. Although the majority of the Pharisees were lay people, there were also some priests and Levites among them, but in smaller numbers. The Pharisees formed closed communities, usually located on the outskirts of Jerusalem, which expanded their influence. The process to enter these communities was quite rigorous. Candidates needed to commit to following the complex and strict Pharisaic laws, which included practices such as the payment of tithes, purification rituals, and special diets. Before being accepted as full members, they went through a period of evaluation and, once approved, took on all the responsibilities and privileges of the community. The leadership of these communities was generally exercised by a scribe, who had the authority to interpret the laws, along with other leaders in some cases. These groups not only provided a space for discussions and mutual support, but also organized regular worship services, mainly on Saturday nights. These services involved Torah studies and communal meals. In addition to their more exclusive communities, the Pharisees also had a significant presence in the synagogues, which served as centers for Torah teaching and charitable activities. The active participation of the Pharisees helped to spread their ideas among many Jews, who agreed with them even without becoming formal members of the communities. You might be curious about what exactly the Pharisees taught. They were very strict in observing not only the written law found in the sacred texts, but also the oral traditions. They believed that this oral law had been transmitted from generation to generation by important figures, starting with Moses, passing through Joshua, the elders, the prophets, and reaching Ezra. According to the Pharisees, these traditions should be followed with as much rigor as the written law, to honor the teachings of the sacred texts. The Pharisees distinguished themselves from other Jewish sects mainly by their dedication to both the written law and the oral tradition, which they considered as inspired and authoritative as the Torah itself. It is believed that this oral tradition began to be developed during the Babylonian exile by Jews committed to maintaining the law. They created explanations and commentaries to protect the written Torah from misinterpretations. Over time, this oral tradition became more complex and was finally documented around the year 200 after Christ, forming a detailed collection of Pharisaic rules. The Pharisees were extremely dedicated to religious practices such as paying tithes, fasting, purification rituals, and observing the laws of the Sabbath. They took these practices so seriously that they went beyond what the Mosaic law required, fasting and tithing more than necessary. For example, they were so strict with the Sabbath rules that they believed if someone had a sore throat on that day, they could swallow vinegar to ease the pain, but gargling would be considered work. Within the group itself, debates arose that led to the formation of two main schools of thought: the school of Shammai, more conservative and rigid, and the school of Hillel, more liberal and focused on adapting the law to contemporary needs. Gamaliel, one of the most famous leaders of the school of Hillel, and mentioned in the Bible as the teacher of Paul of Tarsus, was the grandson of Hillel. In addition to strictly following the oral law, the Pharisees held their own beliefs on topics such as life after death, the existence of angels and demons, free will and determinism, and equality among people. They believed in the immortality of the soul and resurrection after death, which distinguished them from the Sadducees, who did not share these beliefs. The Pharisees also argued that people's actions in this life influence the rewards or punishments in the hereafter. They eagerly anticipated the arrival of the Messiah, who, according to them, would restore Israel and initiate an era of peace and justice. This hope for the future shaped the way they lived and followed the laws, considering them a preparation for this glorious time to come. The Pharisees' doctrine included complex themes such as divine sovereignty and human moral responsibility. They maintained a balance between the idea of free will, which is the ability to make free choices, and determinism, the idea that everything is predetermined. The Pharisees believed that, even with God controlling the events of the world, people still had an active and significant role in choosing between good and evil, being responsible for their own actions. This view differed from other Jewish groups of the time, such as the Sadducees, who emphasized free will more, and the Essenes, who saw everything as predestined and human will as almost irrelevant. Regarding angels and demons, the Pharisees had a quite detailed view, believing in a hierarchy among these entities. This complexity suggests that they developed concepts that go beyond what is explicitly described in the Torah. The New Testament, specifically in the book of Acts of the Apostles, chapter 23, verse 8, mentions that the Pharisees disagreed with the Sadducees on this issue. The Sadducees, in contrast, generally did not believe in the existence of angels and spirits. However, some scholars suggest that this disbelief was not complete, but a rejection of the Pharisees' more elaborate ideas about angels, which proposed a complex hierarchy and the existence of two opposing realms. Amid all these complexities, the question arises: why did Jesus criticize the Pharisees so much? In the New Testament, they are often portrayed negatively. Simply put, Jesus rebuked the Pharisees primarily because they practiced their religion in a hypocritical and prideful manner, leading to showy behavior and a false appearance of holiness. Although the Pharisees had valuable teachings, they often imposed on the people religious rules so strict that not even they could fully follow them. This was, in part, due to a misinterpretation of how good deeds contribute to salvation. The parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector exemplifies this problem well. The Pharisees displayed a superficial spirituality and believed that they could gain God's favor solely through their own efforts and merits. Jesus was quite critical of them, calling them whitewashed tombs and sons of those who killed the prophets and righteous men, from Abel to Zechariah. He described them as blind guides leading the blind, and accused them of making their followers children of hell. Before Jesus, John the Baptist also had his criticisms of both the Pharisees and the Sadducees, calling them a brood of vipers. Although many Pharisees were hostile to Jesus, even participating in plans against his life, they were not all the same. For example, Nicodemus was a Pharisee who showed respect for Jesus and likely became one of his followers. The Talmud, an important text in Judaism, classifies the Pharisees into different types. Some displayed only superficial humility to impress others, while others were truly sincere in their love for God. Among these more authentic Pharisees, in addition to Nicodemus, were figures like the teacher Gamaliel and Saul of Tarsus, who later converted to Christianity and became known as Paul. The renowned Jewish historian and writer Flavius Josephus, who was a member of the Pharisees, left valuable information about this group through his writings. After a great revolt against Rome and the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70 after Christ, other groups such as the Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots disappeared, making the Pharisees the main voice of Judaism at that time. Over time, Pharisaism became practically synonymous with Judaism. Later, in the Christian context, the term Pharisee came to have a negative connotation, used to describe people who exhibit a superficial and hypocritical religiosity, focused more on following rules than on living a true and sincere faith. These people are seen as legalists who do not apply the true principles of faith, justice, and mercy, valuing formalities more than a genuine relationship with God. I hope this explanation has helped you better understand who the Pharisees were and the role they played in the times of Jesus. God bless you, and see you in the next video.